Welcome back. This is a live look at the plane that is carrying former President Jimmy Carter's casket, just moments ago landing in his home state of Georgia. A motorcade will now travel to his native town of Plains, where the former president will have a private burial next to his late wife, Rosalind. CBS News producer Elizabeth Campbell has the latest from Plains. Talk to us, Elizabeth, about where you are, what the rest of today is going to look like honoring the former president, and what should we expect from those private services?
We're here today outside the Maranatha Church. This is a church Jimmy Carter helped found, and it is a church that is synonymous with him. Everyone who knows the former President Carter story knows that he was a Sunday school teacher. Almost every Sunday he was home in Plains. He was here in this church behind me, talking with people, leading that Sunday school, having that community that really brought out his faith. This church is so important to him and to this whole community. We're seeing people starting to file in now. There's some buses just behind me of more folks who are coming through. We've seen members of the community, members of the armed forces. We've seen the National Parks Forest Service, which is really important to President Carter and all that he did with that National Parks land. So this ceremony behind me is going to be a really private, personal, community-driven one. They're going to talk about Mr. Jimmy instead of Mr. President and what he meant to the community here in Plains.
Yeah, Mr. Jimmy, he was so accessible to people. Even if you didn't know him and were meeting him for the first time, you felt like an old friend. And there in Plains, it's become synonymous with the former president. What did the town mean to him and to his late wife, Rosalind?
It can't be overstated how important Plains was to him. You heard his grandson, Jason Carter, talk today in the service that he may have spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. in the White House, but he spent the majority of his time here in Plains. Plains is where he came back to after his time as a midshipman at the Navy University. This is where he came back to after his presidency. He was always coming home to Plains. Plains is synonymous with Jimmy Carter. We were talking with Jill Stuckey, one of his longtime friends, and she says that Plains is now a tourist town because of Jimmy Carter. And it truly is a deeply American story that a town of about 540 people can produce a president like President Jimmy Carter. So when you walk by those stores in Plains, there's a giant Jimmy Carter's hometown sign. They put up signs just last night that said, "God bless Jimmy Carter. Thank you, President Carter." You're starting to see people line up along the motorcade route. I don't know if you can see those pictures. We have them there. They're kind of hanging on, waiting to see the motorcade pass by and pay those final respects to someone that was such a big part of this community.
And his love story with his wife, Rosalind, married longer than any other former presidential and first lady couple. He said once, "I've never won an argument with her, and the only times I thought I had, I found out the argument wasn't over yet." Talk to us a little bit about their story.
Oh, their story is just inspirational. I think about a few things that really exemplifies that. Their offices at the Carter Center in Atlanta, directly across from former President Carter's desk was a picture of Rosalind. And in her office, directly across from her desk, was a picture of former President Carter. So even when they weren't in the same room, they were thinking about each other. He's going to be buried later today at his home next to his wife, Rosalind. Those two love each other so much. There was a quote he said after he won the Nobel Peace Prize that while that was important to him, the biggest prize of his life was when his wife, Rosalind, agreed to marry him. So it really is an inspirational love story for folks across the country.
That is a wonderful quote. Talk to us about what we are also seeing now with the plane having landed. We see that there is a military reception line. Walk us through what else will happen today, as well as the messages that we heard from everyone earlier at his memorial.
Absolutely. So the pictures you're seeing now, yes, it's a military line. Those officials greeting him. There's also members of his Secret Service detail. We say a lot that Jimmy Carter was the former post-presidency, longest-serving post-presidency, but so was his detail. They protected him for all those years. So it was really important to him to include those current and past Secret Service members and their families who also serve in these remembrances. You've seen them across the week, so we're seeing some of that right now. We're also going to see behind me his personal pastor. Pastor Loudon is going to be giving the sermon today in the ceremony, and he's really going to hit on the importance of faith and honor and duty, and that's so much of what we heard in that first service today at the National Cathedral, is how much faith played a role in former President Carter's life, from his beginning, through his time in presidency, through everything he did in his post-presidency, helping people around the world eradicate disease or wage peace, as they say. So that really is, he was known as an intense and dedicated man throughout his entire life, upheld by his faith.
His post-presidential public service, in some ways, the greatest successes that we will remember the former president for. When he left office, at one point, our colleague, Major Garrett, said that he had a public approval rating in the 20s, which is woefully low for any politician, but he was not afraid of failure. In fact, he said, failure is a reality. We all fail at times, and it's painful when we do, but it's better to fail while striving for something wonderful, challenging, adventurous, and uncertain than to say, I don't want to try because I might not succeed completely. And he was not afraid of trying. And we saw that both in his presidency, but then we also saw that in the work that he did afterwards. What have you been hearing from people, particularly about the work that he and Rosalind did post-presidency that made a difference to people locally, nationally, and globally?
Absolutely. I mean, he's the first to admit himself that he was, as he said it, involuntarily retired from the White House. But what a second act that he had. When we talked with his grandson, Jason Carter, just last year around former President Carter's 100th birthday, we asked him, how did his grandfather want to be remembered? And he said he was very proud of the work he achieved those 4 years in the White House, but he was truly proud of the legacy he left with the Carter Center, the work that they've done domestically with democracy, with election watching, the work that they've done internationally, fighting guinea worm and other diseases and bringing health. That is truly the legacy that he will be known. There's some surveys that have shown that his name is what many people internationally remember as the most recognized president. So that's something that he continued to do for decades after, and it's something that the Carter Center plans to continue to do from now on. I mean, as we've talked about before, over half of Americans were born after he left office, but those are impacts that they're continuing to feel from everything after he left office.
And he met people where they were. I remember an episode of The Simpsons, actually, where he appeared, and it was about Habitat for Humanity. Can you tell us more about his legacy in making what was a small, local-ish organization something that had such significance?
Of course, it's important to remember he grew up on his boyhood farm. We've all seen the photos of it from earlier this week. But Habitat for Humanity wasn't a photo op for him. It was skills he already had. He knew how to wield his hammer. He knew how to help build those houses. And he wanted to make that a point for him. He was himself someone who benefited from public housing. After he left the Navy and came back to planes, he went to public housing first. So he knew how important public housing, affordable housing was. So it was a cause that was near and dear to his heart. And it's something that he kept going up. And people have talked about when he was on those Habitat for Humanity sites that he was working harder than everyone else. He didn't want to break. He didn't want to stop. He wanted to keep going, more than some people had energy for, even late into his life. So it was something that was near and dear to him.
And we also talked a bit about his role as a peacemaker. And there were some moments that I think anybody watching at home might have been surprised to see at the National Cathedral, with Obama and Trump sitting next to each other, seeming to enjoy one another's company. There was a handshake between the former President Trump, also the president-elect, as well as his former Vice President, Mike Pence. Talk to us about those moments and how significant they are.
I think it's a famous quote that Carter used from the Bible is, "Blessed be the peacemakers." And that's certainly something he brought here at his last service, his last ceremony, bringing folks together at the National Cathedral. It's one of those uniquely American moments that we see when we have these state funerals of those pictures of all the former president, current president, president-elect lining up. And it's a reminder that as divisive as times can be sometimes, we are still Americans at the end, and we line up together and pay our respects to those who came before us. So I think some people certainly on Twitter were more fascinated by what was going on in that presidential row than maybe necessarily what was going on in the service. But anyone who knew Jimmy Carter would tell you that he would be the first to admit that you have to reach people where they are, like you said earlier, and bringing everyone together for those peace talks and for that moment of reflection.
And let's talk more specifically about some of those efforts at international peace. One of the things that historians have said really doomed his presidency was with negotiations with Tehran. Discuss that moment in American history, because as you say, most Americans, we weren't cognizant during that time if we were even born, but it had a tremendous impact. And I also want to just mention that what our viewers are seeing right now are some of the dignitaries that are leaving the plane. We see that the motorcade is all standing by, and momentarily we expect that we will also see the casket being unloaded there amid the military honors. But Elizabeth, if you could talk a little bit more about that particular moment with Iran, the hostage crisis, and how that affected Carter and his presidency, because I think that it was the way that he decided to handle it was so very much him, but also was part of that reason why he was involuntarily retired.
Yeah, he was the first to admit that that was such a factor in his reelection. He used to always say that if just one chopper had made it through or one more rescue effort had been successful, then maybe he would have gotten another term in that presidency. So it really is what so many of us, even to your point, if we don't remember watching it ourselves, I certainly don't. We've all seen the news footage of the count that the CBS Evening News would end with. It's been X many days with Americans in hostage crisis. So it was something that was constantly talked about. It's something that weighed heavily on him. You mentioned his performance to it. He hated delegating. He wanted to handle everything himself. He wanted to approve every possible plan, everything. He notoriously almost didn't even want to have a chief of staff because he wanted to approve everything himself. So he was really in every detail of that. And he truly was convinced that if he had just managed to get any of those hostages rescued or rescue all of them, he would have been able to have that second-term presidency. And it's something that he wished he could have pulled off. But then we saw that it was, of course, Reagan took office and then they were rescued and released. So it's something that continued to, I don't want to say haunt him, but bother him for years to come of what more could he have done, because he tried everything he could think of.
And they were famously released as that swearing-in ceremony was happening. He learned of this as he was leaving his position as president of the United States and Ronald Reagan was coming in, that the Shah actually held those hostages until that moment. So, Elizabeth, let's check back in on the live images that we're seeing right now and help guide us through a little bit more of what is happening and what to expect.
Absolutely. So this really is his homecoming. This is his final time back to Georgia, the state that meant so much to him as a boy, as a governor, as a president. Georgia was his home. And folks I've talked to here, they talk about how important it was for him to pay his respects at the Carter Center in Atlanta, how important it was for the National Cathedral in that moment. But here in Georgia, here in Plains, this is where he spent most of his time. This is what he always considered home. And so this really is that moment of that poignant reflection that we're going to see for so many of the community and the family members. You're talking about the motorcade, the images you've seen on your screen. We're having the family members of the motorcade are part of that. And so you're seeing his children, his grandson, and his other grandchildren. Those who knew him best are kind of traveling along to this church where they've gathered countless Sundays, listened to their grandfather and their father deliver countless Sunday school lessons. They're all coming back here for that final farewell before they'll be moving on to his house. It was really important to him that he wanted to be buried next to his longtime wife, Rosalind, on that property in his home.
And you mentioned his grandson, who had become something of a family spokesperson. He had a lot to say about his grandfather. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You know, he talked so poignantly about his papa, as he knew him, his grandfather. And over the years, we've been having conversations with Jason Carter. I was talking with him just the day that his grandfather passed away. And he told me that when the first time that his grandfather went into hospice, he was convinced he was only going to have a week left with him. And it was already then a poignant reflection moment. And then they've been blessed, he said, lucky, he said, to have all these extra months, this almost 2 years of extra time to spend together, to talk together, to watch Braves games together. And so I think Jason Carter really put it together great and talked about how he knew him as Papa, but he also knew him as former President Carter. Those moments of being at the White House Easter egg roll as a child, he really just was a stalwart of that family that brought them all together and brought them down to Plains more time than Jason could count.
Elizabeth, our viewers are now seeing the casket has been unloaded. The military officials are standing at attention. Let's pause for a moment and just give our respects. You're hearing in the background there cannons. You see them on the right side of your screen that are being fired in the honor of the late President Jimmy Carter, who has passed away at 100 years of age. This is the blessing, or God's blessing sends us forth, that you're hearing now, the solemnity of the moment. The crowd in attention standing there. The hearse door has been opened. The flag's being carried behind the casket. As CBS News remembers former President Jimmy Carter, now home in Georgia, soon to be laid to rest beside his wife, Rosalind Carter, former First Lady, a private burial and service to be held later today in his home of Plains, Georgia. The door of that hearse now closed. The casket of Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States, inside. He passed away peacefully, according to a family statement on Sunday, December 29th, surrounded by his family and people who loved him. Many of those people now standing and moving to the motorcade to follow that hearse as they travel to a private ceremony in his hometown of Plains. Elizabeth Campbell, if you're still with me now, there's always such power, I think, in those moments and just letting them play out. I want to give you an opportunity to talk to us about a lasting legacy for Jimmy Carter and the work that he did.
I think it's important to remember, especially as we're here, as he makes his way to Maranatha Church, just how important he was to this community. He was really someone who helped put this community back on the map, made it a tourist town for people who wanted to come hear him at his Sunday school. I've been talking with some people who knew him best. He had one of his friends who was cooking dinner for him once a week, and she's just been in disbelief. So this is a very personal loss for so many of the people here, and it's something that they're really rallying together as a community. And that so many of the people we've seen walking into the service behind me are the ones that knew Mr. Jimmy, not Mr. President, the best. As we've talked about his lasting legacy, it was something that was decades long. He was making trips up to Atlanta, about 2.5 hours from here, to lead those Carter Center meetings for so long. He famously kept a Murphy bed in the Carter Center so that he could stay whenever he needed to work through those issues. So I think it's important to remember that this is someone you talked about the importance of how he took his failures. He never stopped serving the community. He never stopped serving the country. He never stopped serving the world. He knew that he had more that he could give, and he continued to give it for as long as he could.
A man of faith and very much a public servant, even more than a politician. Elizabeth Campbell, thank you.